The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped through the mail slot while Marlene Chadwick was pouring her second cup of coffee. She heard the soft thud against the hardwood floor of her entryway but didn't move right away. Mail had become irrelevant to her over the past 3 years. Just bills, advertisements for sales she'd never attend, and the occasional community newsletter from the Cedar Falls library where she no longer volunteered. Nothing in those envelopes ever changed her day. Nothing ever mattered enough to make her heart beat faster. But when she finally walked over and bent down to pick it up, something stopped her mid-reach. The envelope was pale yellow, the kind you don't see much anymore, the kind people used to send wedding invitations in. There was no stamp, no return address, just her name written in black ink across the front. The letters slanted slightly to the right in a way that made her stomach drop. She knew that handwriting. She had seen it on birthday cards, on sticky notes left on the kitchen counter, on the back of a photo from their honeymoon that she'd torn up and thrown away in a moment of rage she could still taste. Preston. Marlene stood there in the narrow hallway, the envelope trembling in her hands, the coffee growing cold on the counter behind her. Outside, the October rain was starting again, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. She should throw it away. She should burn it without opening it. She should do anything except what she was about to do. But her hands were already sliding under the sealed flap, already tearing it open with a violence that surprised her. Inside, there was no letter, no explanation, no apology, just a single white card, the size of a postcard, with one sentence written in the center, the same handwriting, the same slant. "I should have chosen you." Marlene read it once, then again, then a third time, as if repetition would somehow decode a hidden meaning she was missing. But there was nothing else. No signature, no date, no clue as to why, after 3 years of silence, after vanishing from her life like smoke, Preston would send this. Why now? Why these words? And why did they feel less like an apology and more like an accusation? She sank down onto the floor, her back against the wall, still holding the card. The rain outside grew heavier. Somewhere down the street, a car alarm went off and then stopped. Her neighbor's dog barked twice, then fell silent. The world continued as if nothing had happened. But inside Marlene's chest, something had cracked open. A door she had nailed shut. A wound she had convinced herself was healed. Her hands were shaking now. Not from cold. Not from fear. From something older and deeper. Something she thought she'd buried under 3 years of routine and numbness and carefully constructed indifference. She had trained herself not to think about him, not to say his name, not to wonder where he was, or whether he ever thought about what he'd done. And now, with 5 words on a piece of cardstock, he had reached through time and distance and silence to remind her that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Marlene didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long time. Instead, she sat there on the floor, staring at the sentence, feeling the weight of it settle into her bones. The rain kept falling, the coffee kept cooling, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a question began to form. Quiet and insistent, and impossible to ignore. What did he mean? They met at a staff meeting. Marlene was 39, newly transferred to Meadowbrook Elementary after spending 15 years at a school across town. Preston was 42, a vice principal with a reputation for being fair but firm, the kind of man teachers trusted and students respected. He had kind eyes, she remembered thinking, the kind that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the kind that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. Their courtship was slow and deliberate. Coffee after work turned into dinner on weekends. Dinner turned into long drives through the countryside, windows down, radio low, talking about everything and nothing. Preston told her about his failed first marriage, about how his ex-wife had wanted children and he couldn't give her that, about the guilt he still carried. Marlene told him about her own scars, about the years she'd spent caring for her mother through cancer, about the relationships she'd let slip away because she was always too tired, too sad, too unavailable. They bonded over their brokenness. Or at least that's what Marlene thought at the time. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony at the courthouse. Just a few friends and Preston's younger brother Holden as a witness. Marlene wore a cream-colored dress she'd bought on sale. Preston wore a navy suit he already owned. It wasn't the wedding she'd dreamed of as a girl. But at 41, She'd stopped dreaming about fairy tales. She wanted something real, something solid, something that would last. For 4 years, it did. They lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Elm Street, the kind with a front porch and a backyard just big enough for a small garden. Marlene planted tomatoes every spring. Preston grilled on Sundays. They hosted dinners for colleagues, took weekend trips to the coast, fell into a rhythm that felt like contentment. She told herself she was happy, and maybe she was. Or maybe she was just too tired to ask herself the question. The unraveling started with small things. Preston coming home later than usual, texts he'd glance at, and then silence without explanation. A new cologne she didn't recognize. Marlene noticed, but she didn't say anything. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself that after 4 years, relationships naturally shifted, that passion faded into comfort, that this was just what marriage looked like in middle age. But then came the night she couldn't ignore it anymore. Preston had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered. It buzzed once, then twice. Marlene glanced at it without thinking, the way you do when a notification lights up a screen. But the preview of the message made her blood turn cold. I miss you. When can I see you again? The sender's name was Vanessa. Marlene didn't recognize it. She unlocked the phone. His passcode was her birthday, a detail that now felt like mockery, and scrolled through the thread. Months of messages. Affectionate, intimate, planning meetings at hotels, talking about a future that didn't include Marlene. When Preston came out of the bathroom, towel around his waist, hair still damp, he found her sitting at the kitchen table with his phone in front of her. She didn't yell. She didn't throw anything. She just looked at him and asked, "How long?" He didn't lie. Maybe that was the one mercy he gave her. 8 months, he said. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, but not enough. Why? She asked. He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did. But it was too cruel to say out loud. That he'd found someone younger. Someone who laughed more easily. Someone who didn't carry the weight of grief and exhaustion the way Marlene did. So instead, he said, "I'm sorry." 2 weeks later, he was gone. He packed his things while she was at work, left his key on the counter, and walked out of her life as easily as he'd walked into it. No fight, no final conversation. Just absence. And Marlene was left alone in a house that no longer felt like hers, wondering how she'd been so blind. The first week after Preston left, Marlene kept expecting him to come back. She'd hear a car door slam outside, and her heart would jump, thinking it was him returning with some explanation that would make sense of everything. She'd see a shadow pass by the window and turn, half hoping, half dreading to find him standing there. But the shadows were always just trees moving in the wind, and the car doors belonged to neighbors she barely knew. By the second week, she stopped waiting. She called in sick to work, something she'd never done in 23 years of teaching. Her principal, a woman named Dorothy who'd known her since she first started, asked if everything was all right. Marlene said yes, just a stomach bug. She'd be back Monday. But Monday came, and she called in again, and then again. By the third week, Dorothy stopped asking questions and just told her to take whatever time she needed. The house became unbearable. Every room held evidence of the life she thought they'd built together. The kitchen where they'd cooked side by side, where Preston would come up behind her while she chopped vegetables and kissed the back of her neck. The living room where they'd watch movies on Friday nights, his arm draped over her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. The bedroom where they'd made love and made promises, where she'd fallen asleep believing she was safe. She couldn't sleep in that bed anymore. The first few nights she tried. She lay on her side of the mattress, staring at the empty space where he used to be, feeling the absence like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. On the 4th night, she grabbed a pillow and a blanket and moved to the couch. She stayed there for 2 months. Friends tried to reach out. Her colleague Janet brought over a casserole and stood on the porch, knocking softly, calling her name. Marlene watched through the window, holding her breath, waiting until Janet finally gave up and left the dish by the door. It sat there for 3 days before Marlene brought it inside and threw it away, untouched. Her sister called from Portland, said she'd heard what happened, asked if Marlene wanted her to come stay for a while. Marlene said no, she was fine. She just needed some time alone. Her sister didn't push. The silence was the worst part. The house had never been loud. They weren't the type of couple who fought or laughed raucously or played music at full volume, but there had been sound. Preston humming in the shower, the rustle of newspaper pages at breakfast, the soft murmur of his voice when he talked on the phone. Now there was nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling and the sound of her own breathing, which sometimes felt too loud in the emptiness. She started leaving the television on, even when she wasn't watching it. The noise helped. It filled the space. It made the house feel less like a tomb. She'd fall asleep on the couch with sitcom reruns playing, wake up at 3 a.m. to infomercials selling kitchen gadgets she'd never buy, and lie there in the blue glow of the screen, too exhausted to move. Food became irrelevant. She lost 12 pounds in the first month without trying. Her clothes hung loose on her frame. Her face looked hollow in the bathroom mirror, eyes sunken and shadowed. She looked like someone recovering from a long illness, which in a way she supposed she was. But the physical changes were nothing compared to what was happening inside. There was a numbness settling into her bones, a kind of emotional frost that made everything feel distant and muted. She stopped crying after the first few weeks, not because the pain had lessened, but because she'd run out of tears. Or maybe she'd just learned that crying didn't change anything. Preston was still gone. The betrayal still existed. The life she'd believed in was still a lie. By the time she finally returned to work, 6 weeks after Preston left, she'd learned to function on autopilot. Smile, nod, answer questions with the minimum required words. Everyone could see something had broken in her, but Marlene had perfected the art of deflection. She was fine, just tired, just adjusting, just needed time. But time, she was learning, didn't heal anything. It just taught you how to live with the wound. 3 years passed like water through a sieve, constant but leaving nothing behind. Marlene was 46 now, though she rarely thought about her age. Birthdays had become just another day, marked only by a card from her sister and a half-hearted celebration with co-workers who brought grocery store cake to the teacher's lounge. She still lived in the house on Elm Street. She'd thought about selling it 100 times, but the idea of packing up everything, of sorting through the remnants of her old life, felt insurmountable. So she stayed. She'd removed the obvious traces of Preston, his clothes donated, his books boxed up and stored in the garage, the photos taken down and hidden in a drawer she never opened. But his ghost lingered in subtler ways. The coffee maker he'd bought, the dining table they'd picked out together, the small crack in the bathroom tile from when he'd dropped a bottle of aftershave. Her days followed a rigid pattern. She woke at 6:15, made coffee, showered, dressed in one of the 7 outfits she rotated through the week. She left for school at 7:30, taught her 4th grade class with the same lesson plans she'd refined over 2 decades, ate lunch alone in her classroom while grading papers, and returned home by 4. Dinner was usually something microwavable. She'd learned that cooking for one felt more depressing than not cooking at all. Evenings were the hardest. That stretch between 6 and 10 when the house was too quiet and the night was too long. She filled the time with television, crime dramas mostly, stories about other people's tragedies that made her own feel smaller by comparison. She'd watch until her eyes grew heavy, then climb into bed around 11. She'd moved back to the bedroom after that first year, but she still slept only on her side, as if Preston's half of the mattress was contaminated somehow. Weekends were worse. Saturday mornings she'd grocery shop, moving through the aisles with mechanical efficiency, buying the same items every week. Saturday afternoons she'd clean the house, not because it was dirty, but because it gave her something to do. Sundays she'd sometimes go to the library, browse the new releases, check out books she'd never finish. The librarian, an older woman named Helen, would always greet her warmly, ask how she was doing. Marlene would always say, "Fine, thank you," and hurry to the checkout desk. People had stopped trying to fix her. In the beginning, there'd been invitations, dinner parties, book clubs, a colleague's daughter's wedding. Marlene had declined them all with polite excuses until the invitations stopped coming. Janet still tried occasionally, suggesting they grab coffee or see a movie, but Marlene had perfected the art of being too busy, too tired, too something. Eventually, Janet got the message. The truth was, Marlene had forgotten how to connect. Conversations felt like performance, requiring energy she didn't have. Smiling hurt. Laughing felt foreign. She'd become fluent in the language of fine, of okay, of managing. She'd learned to exist without actually living. Her students were the only ones who still reached her, though she tried not to let them too close. They were 9 and 10 years old, still young enough to be honest, still unguarded enough to ask direct questions. "Why don't you smile more, Mrs. Chadwick? Are you sad? Do you have kids?" The questions pierced through her armor in ways adult politeness never could. She'd deflect gently, redirect them back to their work, but sometimes she'd catch herself wondering what they saw when they looked at her. A tired woman, a lonely woman, a woman who'd given up. At night, lying in bed, she'd sometimes think about Preston, not with longing. That had died somewhere in the second year, but with a kind of detached curiosity. Where was he? Was he still with Vanessa? Had he built the life with her that he'd abandoned with Marlene? Did he ever think about what he'd done? Did he feel guilty? Did he feel anything at all? She never looked him up online, never drove past his new address, which she could have easily found, never asked mutual acquaintances about him. She'd severed that connection completely, or at least she thought she had. But some part of her, buried deep and refusing to die, still carried him, still wondered, still ached in ways she couldn't name. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 years and 2 months after he'd walked out, the yellow envelope arrived, and everything she'd carefully constructed, the routine, the numbness, the controlled forgetting, began to crack. Marlene kept the card on her kitchen counter for 3 days. She'd walk past it in the morning on her way to make coffee, glance at it when she came home from work, see it sitting there in the periphery of her vision while she ate her microwave dinners. She didn't pick it up again after that first morning. Didn't reread the words. She didn't need to. They were burned into her memory now, playing on a loop in her mind whether she wanted them there or not. I should have chosen you. Should have. Past tense. As if the chance had come and gone. As if there had been a moment when Preston stood at a crossroads and consciously decided to walk away from her. And now, 3 years later, he regretted it. But why tell her? What was she supposed to do with this information? Was she supposed to feel vindicated? Victorious? Was she supposed to forgive him? On Thursday evening, she picked up the card again, turned it over. The back was blank. She held it up to the light, looking for watermarks, hidden messages, anything that might explain more than those 5 words. Nothing. She examined the envelope again, checked for a postmark. There wasn't one, which meant someone had hand-delivered it. Someone had walked up to her door, slipped it through her mail slot, and walked away. The thought made her skin crawl. Had Preston been here? Had he stood on her porch, just feet away from where she'd been drinking her coffee, and left this without knocking? She called Janet that night. It was the first time she'd initiated contact with anyone in months. Janet answered on the second ring, surprise evident in her voice. They made small talk for a few minutes. How was school? How were Janet's kids? Yes, the weather had been dreary. Then Marlene asked, as casually as she could manage, if Janet had heard anything about Preston lately, where he was, what he was doing. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Janet said carefully that she'd heard through the grapevine that Preston had moved to Portland about 6 months ago, that he'd taken a position at a private school there, that he was no longer with Vanessa. Apparently that had ended badly about a year after he'd left Marlene. No, Janet didn't know if he was seeing anyone now. Why was Marlene asking? Marlene lied. Said she was just curious, that she'd seen someone who looked like him at the grocery store, and wondered if he'd moved back to the area. Janet seemed to accept this, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. They talked for a few more minutes, then said goodbye. Marlene hung up and stared at the card again. Portland was 4 hours away. There was no way Preston had driven here to deliver this himself, which meant he'd sent someone, or mailed it without postage, hoping the postal service would deliver it anyway. Or, and this thought twisted something in her chest, he'd given it to someone who was already here, someone who knew where she lived, someone who'd agreed to deliver it for him. She thought about the handwriting again. She'd been so certain it was Preston's when she first saw it. But now, looking at it more closely, she wasn't sure. The slant was right, the way the capital letters curved, but something about the pressure of the pen felt different, lighter, less confident, as if whoever wrote it had been copying someone else's style. On Friday morning, Marlene took a sick day. She told herself it was because she hadn't slept well, which was true. She'd lain awake until after 2, staring at the ceiling, her mind turning over every possible explanation for the card. But the real reason was that she couldn't face her classroom, couldn't pretend to be present and patient with her students when her entire world felt like it was tilting sideways again. She spent the morning in her bathrobe, drinking coffee and pacing. She picked up the card, put it down, picked it up again. Around noon, she did something she'd sworn she'd never do. She went into the garage, found the box where she'd stored Preston's things, and pulled out the stack of old cards he'd given her over the years. Birthdays, anniversaries, Valentine's Days. She laid them out on the dining room table, comparing the handwriting. They matched. Sort of. The style was the same, but the newer card's writing was shakier, less practiced, as if someone had tried to forge it and almost succeeded, or as if Preston himself had written it, but his hand had been unsteady. Sick, maybe, or drunk, or emotional in a way that made the pen waver. Marlene sat down heavily in one of the dining chairs, surrounded by ghosts of better days, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt something other than numbness. She felt anger, hot and sharp and clarifying. How dare he reach back into her life like this? How dare he send cryptic messages that solved nothing and explained nothing? How dare he make her feel anything at all? She gathered up the old cards, shoved them back in the box, and carried it to the garage. Then she took the yellow envelope and the card with its terrible 5 words, walked to the fireplace she never used, and struck a match. But she didn't light it. She stood there, match burning down toward her fingers, and realized she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she knew what it meant. The memories came back in fragments, unbidden and relentless. Marlene would be grading papers and suddenly remember the way Preston used to read over her shoulder, offering unnecessary suggestions that always made her laugh. She'd be driving to work and recall the road trip they'd taken to the coast, how they'd gotten lost and ended up in a tiny town with one diner, how they'd eaten pie and joked about running away and opening a bed and breakfast. She'd be falling asleep and feel the phantom weight of his arm around her waist, the way he used to pull her close in the middle of the night without waking. The worst part was that the memories weren't all painful. Some of them were beautiful, and that made everything more confusing. Because if parts of their marriage had been real, if there had been genuine love and tenderness and joy, then how had he been able to betray her so completely? How had he been able to look at her every day for 8 months while carrying on with someone else? Had he felt guilty? Had he thought about ending it with Vanessa and choosing Marlene instead? Was that what the card meant? That there had been a moment when he'd almost stayed, and he'd chosen wrong? She started dreaming about him. Not nightmares exactly, but strange, disjointed scenes that left her feeling hollowed out when she woke. In one dream, they were back in the courthouse on their wedding day, but when Preston lifted her veil, his face was blank, no features, just smooth skin where his eyes and mouth should have been. In another, she was searching through their old house, room by room, calling his name, but every door she opened led to an empty space, walls bare, floors cold. On Saturday, a week after the card arrived, Marlene found herself driving past their old house without planning to. She told herself she was just running errands, that this route was more convenient, but she knew she was lying. She slowed down as she approached Elm Street. No, wait. She still lived there. It was Preston's new place she was thinking about, except she didn't know where that was. He'd moved to Portland, Janet said, which meant he wasn't even in Cedar Falls anymore. So what was she doing? What was she looking for? She pulled over on a side street and gripped the steering wheel, breathing hard. This was exactly what Preston wanted, wasn't it? To get back inside her head, to make her think about him again, to disrupt the careful equilibrium she'd built. And it was working. God, it was working. She was obsessing over 5 words the way she'd once obsessed over those text messages, analyzing every possible meaning, driving herself slowly insane. That afternoon, she went to her bedroom and pulled out the drawer she never opened. Inside were the photos she'd hidden away. Their wedding photos, vacation snapshots, candid shots from lazy Sunday mornings. She'd kept them out of some misguided sense that erasing the evidence would be like admitting she'd imagined it all. But looking at them now, she realized how young she looked in these pictures, how hopeful, how stupidly, devastatingly happy. There was one photo in particular that made her chest ache. They were sitting on the back porch, late evening light making everything golden. Preston's arm was around her shoulders. Her head was tilted toward him, eyes closed, the hint of a smile on her lips. She looked peaceful, safe, loved. The camera had caught her in a moment of pure contentment, and looking at it now felt like looking at a stranger. When had she last felt that way? When had she last let her guard down enough to close her eyes and lean into someone, trusting they wouldn't let her fall? She thought about the card again. I should have chosen you. The more she turned it over in her mind, the less sense it made. Chosen her over what? Over Vanessa? But he'd already left Marlene for Vanessa. Janet said that relationship had ended. So what was he trying to say? That he regretted leaving? That he wanted her back? The thought made her stomach turn. Did he really think she'd take him back after what he'd done? Did he think she was that desperate, that broken, that she'd welcome him with open arms and pretend the past 3 years hadn't happened? But there was a smaller voice in the back of her mind, one she tried to ignore, that whispered, would you, if he showed up at your door right now, apologetic and sincere, promising it would never happen again, would you turn him away? Or would you, in your loneliness and exhaustion, consider it? Would some part of you want to go back to when things felt simple, even if you knew it was an illusion? Marlene didn't want to answer that question. Instead, she gathered up the photos, put them back in the drawer, and closed it firmly. She went to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of wine, something she rarely did. Then she sat at the table, the yellow card in front of her, and made a decision. She would stop trying to figure out what Preston meant. She would stop analyzing the handwriting and dissecting the words and imagining scenarios. She would put the card away and move on with her life, just as she'd been doing for 3 years. It was just 5 words. It didn't have to mean anything. It didn't have to change anything. But even as she made this resolution, she knew she wouldn't keep it. Because the truth was, Preston had already changed something. He'd reminded her that she was still capable of feeling, and she wasn't sure if that was a gift or a curse. Marlene hadn't been to Riverside Café in almost 3 years. It was the place she used to go on Sunday afternoons when she needed to escape the house. Back when writing felt like something she could still do. She'd order a cappuccino, sit by the window overlooking the small creek that ran behind the building, and fill notebooks with half-formed thoughts that never quite became anything. But after Preston left, the cafe had felt tainted somehow, too connected to the person she used to be. Now, on a gray Wednesday afternoon in late October, she found herself pulling into the parking lot without having consciously decided to go there. She'd left school early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely a lie, and had driven aimlessly for 20 minutes before ending up here. The building looked the same. Brick facade, dark green awning, the hand-painted sign that had been there for decades. Through the window, she could see it was nearly empty. Just a couple of college students hunched over laptops, and an elderly man reading a newspaper. The bell above the door chimed when she entered. The smell hit her immediately. Roasted coffee beans, cinnamon, something baking in the back. It was so familiar it hurt. She ordered a cappuccino from a barista she didn't recognize. A young woman with pink hair and a nose ring who smiled mechanically while making change. Marlene took her cup to her old spot by the window, the corner table with the wobbly leg that no one ever bothered to fix. She sat down and stared out at the creek. The water was higher than she remembered, swollen from recent rains, moving fast over the rocks. Leaves floated on the surface, orange and red and brown, autumn's debris. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup and tried to remember what it had felt like to sit here and feel creative, to believe she had something worth saying. It felt like remembering someone else's life. She didn't hear him approach, didn't realize anyone was standing beside her table until a voice said her name. Not a question, just a statement, quiet and careful. Marlene. She looked up and for a disorienting moment didn't recognize him. Then everything clicked into place, and her heart did something painful in her chest. Holden Hartwell, Preston's younger brother. She hadn't seen him since the divorce, if you could call it that, when there were no papers, no lawyers, just one person leaving and another person staying behind. He looked different. Older, though he couldn't be more than 38 now. His hair was longer than she remembered, touching his collar, and there was gray at his temples that hadn't been there before. He wore a dark jacket over a flannel shirt, jeans that looked worn in rather than fashionable. His face was thinner, more angular, but his eyes were the same, brown and serious and impossibly kind. "Holden?" she said, and was surprised her voice came out steady. "Hi, I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I don't mean to intrude. I saw you sitting here and I thought—" He stopped, seeming unsure how to finish the sentence. His hands were in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, as if he was trying to make himself smaller, less threatening. Marlene didn't know what to say. The last time she'd seen Holden was at her house, 3 weeks after Preston left, when he'd shown up unannounced with a casserole his girlfriend at the time had made. He'd stood on her porch looking miserable, apologizing for his brother, saying he'd tried to talk sense into Preston but failed. Marlene had thanked him, taken the casserole, and closed the door before he could see her start to cry. "It's okay," she said now, though she wasn't sure it was. "Do you want to sit?" The invitation surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. He hesitated, studying her face as if trying to determine whether she meant it. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly, like someone approaching a wounded animal. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe's background music, something acoustic and melancholy, filled the silence. Outside, a crow landed on the bank of the creek, pecked at something in the mud, then flew away. Marlene took a sip of her cappuccino and found it had already gone lukewarm. "How have you been?" Holden asked finally. The question sounded genuine, not the automatic politeness most people offered. Marlene considered lying. Fine, good, managing. But something about the way he was looking at her, not with pity, just with honest concern, made her tell the truth. "I don't know," she said. "Some days better than others." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I heard you're still teaching at Meadowbrook. 23 years this fall." She traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "You? I'm doing carpentry now. Custom furniture mostly. I have a workshop downtown on 5th Street. He paused. "I left the school district about 2 years ago. Needed a change." Marlene remembered that Holden had been a music teacher at the high school, that he'd played guitar and had tried, unsuccessfully, to start a band with some other teachers. Preston used to joke about it, gently mocking but never cruel. She wondered if Holden had left because of Preston, because working in the same district where his brother had been vice principal was too uncomfortable after everything that happened. "I'm glad you found something you enjoy," she said, and meant it. Holden looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred in ways they hadn't been when he was a teacher. When he looked up again, there was something in his expression that made Marlene's pulse quicken. Not fear exactly, but anticipation, like she was standing at the edge of something and didn't know whether to step forward or back. "Marlene," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." Marlene's grip tightened on her cup. The cafe suddenly felt too warm, too close. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and quick. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Had known since the moment she'd looked up and seen him standing beside her table. This wasn't a coincidence. He hadn't just happened to be here. Holden glanced around the cafe as if checking whether anyone was listening, but the college students were absorbed in their screens, and the elderly man had left. Still, he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "The card you received, the one that came in the yellow envelope last week." He paused, watching her face. "That was from me." The words hung in the air between them. Marlene felt her stomach drop, felt the room tilt sideways just slightly. She'd known, hadn't she? Some part of her had suspected when she looked at the handwriting more closely, when she'd noticed the shakiness, the careful copying. But hearing it confirmed was different. It made it real. "Why?" The word came out harder than she'd intended. "Why would you do that?" Holden's hands were flat on the table now, palms down, as if he needed to steady himself. "Because it's the truth," he said. "Preston did say that. Not to you. He said it to me, about a year ago. We were having dinner, and he'd had too much to drink, and it came out. He said he should have chosen you, that leaving you was the biggest mistake of his life." Marlene felt something cold spreading through her chest. "And you thought I needed to know that? You thought that would somehow make things better?" "No." Holden shook his head quickly. "I didn't send it because of Preston. I sent it because—" He stopped, took a breath, started again. "I've thought about you every day for 3 years, Marlene. Every single day. And I know how that sounds. I know it's—" He rubbed a hand over his face, frustrated with himself. "When Preston left you, I wanted to reach out. I wanted to check on you, to make sure you were okay, but I didn't think I had the right. I'm his brother. I'm part of the family that hurt you. So you forged a message from him instead." Marlene heard the anger in her voice but couldn't control it. "You made me think he'd come back. That he'd been here. That he—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. Afraid if she kept talking, she'd start crying. "I know," Holden said quietly. "I know it was wrong. I practiced his handwriting for weeks because I thought— I don't know what I thought. That maybe if it came from him, you'd actually read it, that you'd believe it. But it wasn't really about what Preston said. It was about what I wanted to say and didn't know how." Marlene stared at him. Outside, it had started to rain. Light drops streaking the window. "What are you talking about?" Holden met her eyes, and she saw something there she hadn't expected. Vulnerability, yes, but also determination. The look of someone who'd made a decision and was going to see it through, no matter the cost. "I should have chosen you," he said. "That's what I wanted to tell you. Not that Preston should have, though he should have, but that I should have. 3 years ago, when everything fell apart, I should have been braver. I should have told you how I felt instead of standing back and watching you disappear into yourself." The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the roof. Marlene could hear her own heartbeat, loud in her ears. "How you felt," she repeated, the words foreign in her mouth. "I've been in love with you since the first time Preston brought you to a family dinner," Holden said. His voice was steady now, like he'd been holding these words in for so long that letting them out was a relief. 7 years ago, you wore a green dress and you laughed at one of my terrible jokes, and I thought you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And then Preston married you, and I told myself to get over it, that it didn't matter what I felt because you were his wife, and I'd never do that to him. I'd never do that to you." Marlene couldn't speak, couldn't think. The world had narrowed to this moment, this table, this man sitting across from her saying impossible things. "But then he left," Holden continued, "and I watched you suffer, and I did nothing because I thought it would be selfish. I thought you'd see me as just another Hartwell man trying to take something from you, so I stayed away. I let you grieve. I let 3 years pass." He paused, his jaw tight. "But I couldn't stop thinking about you. And when Preston said what he said, when I heard those words come out of his mouth, I realized he was right. He should have chosen you. And his voice cracked slightly. "I wanted to choose you. I wanted to tell you that you deserve someone who sees you, who doesn't take you for granted, who—" "Stop," Marlene said. The word came out as a whisper. "Please stop." Holden fell silent. The rain continued. Somewhere in the back of the café, the espresso machine hissed. Marlene felt like she was drowning, like the air had become too thick to breathe. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But it was. Marlene left the café without answering him. She grabbed her purse, mumbled something about needing to go, and walked out into the rain without an umbrella. Holden didn't follow her, which she was grateful for, though part of her, a part she didn't want to acknowledge, had hoped he would. She sat in her car for 10 minutes, rain hammering the windshield, hands shaking so badly she couldn't get the key in the ignition. When she finally managed to start the engine, she drove home in a daze, seeing nothing, feeling everything. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay in bed replaying the conversation, dissecting every word, every look, every inflection in Holden's voice. He'd been in love with her for 7 years. 7 years, while she'd been married to his brother, while she'd been falling apart after Preston left, while she'd been building her fortress of numbness and routine. He'd been there, watching, waiting, loving her from a distance she hadn't even known existed. It felt impossible. It felt like a trap. It felt like the cruelest kind of hope, the kind that could destroy her all over again if she let herself believe in it. But over the following days, something strange happened. Holden didn't push, didn't show up at her door or call her phone or send more mysterious cards. He simply existed, at a careful distance, letting her process what he'd told her. And in that space, Marlene found herself thinking about him in ways she hadn't allowed herself to think about anyone in 3 years. She remembered things she'd forgotten, the way he'd always been kind to her at family gatherings, asking about her students, actually listening to her answers instead of waiting for his turn to talk. The way he'd shown up after Preston left, bringing food, offering help. His face twisted with an anguish that she'd assumed was guilt by association, but now wondered if it had been something deeper, the way he'd never once spoken badly about her to Preston, even though she'd learned from mutual friends that Preston had tried to paint her as cold, distant, impossible to please. On Saturday, nearly a week after their conversation at the café, Marlene was in the produce section of the grocery store when she saw him. He was examining avocados with an intensity that would have been funny under different circumstances. He looked up, saw her, and froze. For a moment they just stared at each other across a display of apples. Then he raised his hand in a small, tentative wave. She found herself waving back before she could think better of it. He walked over slowly, pushing his cart. "Hi," he said. Just that. Nothing more. "Hi," Marlene replied. Her heart was beating too fast, but her voice came out steady. They stood there in awkward silence for a moment. Then Holden said, "I'm sorry. For ambushing you at the café. For the card. For all of it. I shouldn't have. I had no right to." He stopped, looking miserable. "No," Marlene said quietly. "You didn't." She watched him flinch. Watched the hope drain from his face. Then she added, "But I'm glad you did." His head came up sharply. "You are? I don't know what to do with what you told me," she said. "I don't know how to feel about it. But I'm tired of being numb. I'm tired of going through the motions. And you," she paused, surprised by her own honesty. "You made me feel something, even if it was just confusion and anger. That's more than I've felt in a long time." Something shifted in Holden's expression. Not quite relief, but close. "Can I buy you coffee sometime?" he asked. No pressure, no expectations, just coffee. Marlene thought about saying no. It would be easier, safer. But she'd been choosing safe for 3 years, and it had only made her smaller, quieter, more invisible. So instead, she heard herself say, "Okay, yes." They met 3 days later, back at Riverside Café. Holden was already there when she arrived, sitting at a table in the middle of the room, not by the windows where they'd talked before. He stood when he saw her, pulled out her chair, a gesture that felt old-fashioned and sweet, and made her chest ache slightly. They talked for 2 hours, about nothing important, about everything, his furniture business, her students, books they'd read, places they wanted to travel but probably never would. He told her about the guitar he was building in his workshop, how he was teaching himself to inlay mother-of-pearl in intricate patterns. She told him about the novels she'd tried to write years ago and abandoned, how sometimes she still thought about those characters, wondered what had happened to them. It was the most normal conversation Marlene had had in years, and somehow that made it extraordinary. They started meeting regularly after that, once a week at first, then twice, then every few days, always at the café, always in the afternoon when it was quiet. They never talked about Preston. They never talked about the past or the future or what they were doing. They just talked, and slowly, Marlene felt something in her chest beginning to thaw, not healed, not whole, but warming. One afternoon in early November, Holden brought her a wooden box he'd made. It was small, cedar, with a hinged lid and delicate carved flowers on the top. "For you," he said simply, setting it on the table between them. "I thought you might like it." Marlene opened it. The inside was lined with burgundy velvet and smelled like wood shavings and varnish. It was beautiful, functional, made by hand for her specifically. She looked up at him and saw he was nervous, waiting for her reaction like it mattered more than anything. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. Winter came to Cedar Falls with unusual gentleness that year. The snow fell soft and steady, blanketing the town in white that looked clean instead of oppressive. Marlene had always hated winter before. The darkness, the cold, the way it made her want to hibernate until spring. But this year felt different. This year, she had somewhere to be. Holden's workshop was warm despite the season. He'd installed a wood stove in the corner that radiated heat and made the whole space smell like smoke and sawdust. Marlene started spending her Saturday afternoons there, sitting in an old armchair he'd reupholstered, watching him work. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. The silence between them had become comfortable, companionable, the kind that didn't need filling. She learned the names of his tools, learned to tell the difference between oak and maple by the grain, learned that he hummed while he worked, old songs she half recognized from decades past. He learned that she liked her coffee with too much cream, learned that she was afraid of spiders but not snakes, learned that when she was nervous, she twisted her wedding ring, except she'd stopped wearing it sometime in December and hadn't even noticed until he pointed it out. They still hadn't kissed, hadn't held hands beyond the brief moments when he'd help her with her coat or guide her around a piece of equipment, but there was an intimacy growing between them that felt more profound than anything physical. He saw her, actually saw her. Not the woman she'd been with Preston, not the broken version of herself she'd become after, but who she was now, in this moment, still figuring out how to be whole again. On Christmas Eve, he invited her to his apartment for dinner. It was small, above a bakery on 3rd Street, with slanted ceilings and windows that overlooked the town square. He'd cooked, nothing fancy, just roast chicken and vegetables, and they ate by candlelight because a fuse had blown and he hadn't gotten around to fixing it yet. They laughed about it, about the absurdity of a carpenter who couldn't manage his own electrical system, and the laughter felt like medicine. After dinner, they sat on his couch with mugs of tea, watching snow fall past the window. The town square below was decorated with lights, though most of the shops were closed. A few people hurried past, bundled against the cold, heading home to their own celebrations. Marlene felt Holden's hand brush against hers, hesitant, questioning. She turned her palm up and let him lace his fingers through hers. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just being. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" "For being patient. For not trying to fix me. For being here." Holden squeezed her hand gently. "You don't need fixing, Marlene. You never did." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw everything she'd been too afraid to see before. The way he looked at her like she was something precious. The way his presence made her feel safe without making her feel small. The way he'd chosen her, again and again, without ever asking for anything in return. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said. The words surprised her even as she said them, but they felt true, terrifyingly, beautifully true. Holden's breath caught. "You think?" "I know," she corrected. "I know I am." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but she didn't want to. She met him halfway, and when his lips touched hers, it felt like coming home. Not to the home she'd had before, but to something new. Something she'd built brick by brick over these past months. Something that was hers. A week later, Marlene sat down at her kitchen table with a blank piece of paper and a pen. She'd thought about this for days, turned it over in her mind until she knew exactly what she wanted to say. The card Holden had sent her was still in the cedar box he'd made, tucked in her bedroom dresser. She took it out, read it one more time, then set it aside. Then she began to write, not to Preston, not to Holden, but to herself, to the woman she'd been 3 years ago. Devastated and alone and convinced she'd never feel anything again. She wrote about the pain that had brought her here, about the darkness she'd had to walk through, about learning that betrayal, while it breaks you, doesn't have to destroy you, that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads you exactly where you need to be. She wrote about Holden, about his patience and his kindness, and the way he'd loved her, even when she couldn't love herself. She wrote about discovering that real love doesn't announce itself with fireworks and grand gestures. It whispers. It waits. It shows up in coffee dates and wooden boxes and quiet Saturday afternoons. It chooses you, over and over, until one day you realize you're choosing it back. When she finished, she folded the letter and put it in the cedar box with Holden's card. Someday, maybe, she'd show it to him. Or maybe she'd keep it private. A reminder of how far she'd come. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd written it, that she'd acknowledged the journey, that she'd thanked the pain for bringing her here. Because the truth was, if Preston hadn't left, she never would have found Holden. She never would have learned that the love she'd settled for wasn't the love she deserved. She never would have discovered that at 46, after betrayal and heartbreak and 3 years of numbness, she could still bloom. And if you're reading this, if you're going through your own darkness right now, wondering if you'll ever feel whole again, I want you to know something. The light is coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it's coming. And when it arrives, it might look different than you expected. It might come from the last person you'd imagine, but it will be real, and it will be yours. Subscribe to hear more stories like this. Stories of women who survived betrayal and found something better on the other side. Because your story isn't over yet, and the best chapter might still be waiting to be written.